The iPad 10 and the iPad Air 5 look so much alike to where you might think that you can save $150 and essentially get the same thing. But practically speaking, there are some very meaningful differences that make them quite different. So let's find out which is the better fit for what you need, and this ended up going in a different direction than I expected. And by the way, I know that prices outside of the US are sometimes really different than what we have, so if you're watching this from outside the US, let me know where you're from and what the prices are where you live. So the first thing most people consider is the display, and in this case, both iPads have a 10.9-inch Liquid Retina display with the same resolution, the same pixel density, the same peak brightness, and both are 60 Hz displays. But then we start seeing some differences. The iPad Air 5 display has an anti-reflective coating, so it's a better choice if you want to use it outside or in environments where you may have to deal with reflections. It's also a P3 display versus sRGB on the iPad 10, so we're getting a wider color gamut for more accurate color reproduction. And finally, it's fully laminated, so the display, the touch layer, and the cover glass are fused together into a single display assembly where the image looks like it's painted right on top of the glass. On the iPad 10, there is an air gap between the display and then the combination of the cover glass and touch layer. For a lot of things like watching movies, surfing the web, or playing games, it's not really something that you're gonna notice unless you actually look for it. But when you're using the Apple Pencil, it does make a difference. So with the iPad 10, you're going to be able to see a separation between the tip of the pencil and the content that's being created, especially if you're looking at an angle. With the iPad Air 5, because the image looks like it's painted right on top of the glass, it looks like the tip of the pencil is actually touching the line or the content that's being created, and that's of course better. There's also another really important difference when it comes to the Apple Pencil, but first let's take a look at the design. So like I said at the beginning, these iPads look a lot alike. They both have rounded corners, squared off edges, and uniform bezels all the way around. Both iPads have 4 speaker grills, but only 2 speakers, one on each side, and I sort of assumed that they would sound the same, but they don't. The iPad Air 5 speakers get louder, there's noticeably more bass, and the mids and the highs have much more presence to them. So overall, whether you're watching a movie, listening to music, or playing games, the iPad Air 5 speakers are clearly the better choice. Now, continuing around the edges, we see the power button with built-in Touch ID for biometric authentication, and this year we finally got a USB-C port on the entry-level iPad. Now, that means that you can charge both of these iPads more quickly, you can connect USB-C hubs, you can use external SSDs, and you can connect an external display, but these ports are not the same. For external displays, the iPad 10 supports up to 1080p 60 or 4K 30. The iPad Air 5 can go up to 6K 60 Hz. And another interesting difference has to do with file transfer speed. So even though both 64GB models had similar SSD read and write speeds, the same 940 megabyte clip took significantly longer to copy onto the iPad 10 than the iPad Air 5. Now, finishing up the design differences, the smart connector on the iPad Air 5 is on the back versus the side of the iPad 10, and that leads to different types of Magic Keyboard compatibility. The traditional one works with the iPad Air 5, and then the new Magic Keyboard Folio works with the iPad 10. And speaking of accessories, one of the most confusing decisions by Apple has to do with Apple Pencil support. So the iPad Air 5 is compatible with the 2nd generation Apple Pencil, which pairs and charges wirelessly, and it's stored on the side of the iPad. The iPad 10, which also has a USB-C port, is still only compatible with the 1st generation Apple Pencil, which of course has a Lightning connector. That means that you need an adapter and a USB-C to USB-C cable in order to pair and charge the pencil. Now, to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And as much as I didn't like having to plug the 1st generation Apple Pencil into the Lightning port of my iPad 9, it's still better than having to remember where I put the adapter every time I want to charge it. Now, as far as the camera systems, they're identical in terms of the number of cameras, the resolution, the frame rate, 4K, slow motion, zoom, cinematic stabilization, smart HDR3 for photos. You're essentially getting the same hardware and specs, but of course the two iPads have 2 different chips with different image signal processors. Also on the iPad 10, the front-facing camera was moved to the longer side, so now you're framed right in the center instead of off to the side like with every other iPad. So let's look at a sample. Here's a camera and microphone comparison of the iPad 10 and the iPad Air 5. This should give you a pretty good idea of the type of image that you're going to get and the type of audio that you should expect. Now, another thing that I want you to notice is this is me looking at the screen on the iPad Air 5, and this is me looking at the camera on the iPad Air 5. With the iPad 10, this is me looking at the screen, and this is me looking at the camera. So this is much better framing in my opinion. When I was talking about the ISP, I mentioned that we're getting two different chips. And the iPad 10 has the A14 BIONIC with 4 GB of RAM, and the iPad Air 5 has the more powerful M1 chip with 8 GB of RAM. When we look at performance, the M1 outperforms the A14 for both single and multi-core performance. It also has 4 high-performance cores instead of 2. On top of that, we see that the M1 scores higher in GPU performance, where we're getting an 8-core GPU versus a 4-core GPU on the A14. Now, of course, these are just benchmark scores, and the differences aren't going to be super meaningful for the vast majority of users. And whenever you look at benchmark scores or specs, you should always ask yourself, what does this mean for what I do? Well, if you're just surfing the web, watching video, and going on social media, then it doesn't really mean very much, other than the fact that with the M1, you have additional processing headroom as the iPad gets older or maybe your needs change. On the other hand, if you're doing something like very heavy video editing, then you could benefit from the hardware accelerated H.264 and the HEVC on the M1, as well as the video decode and encode engines. For general multitasking, so that's multiple apps open in split view, pop-up windows, or slide over windows, I have not noticed a meaningful difference. Both iPads perform great and they both support iPadOS 16. Now, battery life is always interesting because every current iPad has the same rating, up to 10 hours of surfing the web on Wi-Fi or watching video, and up to 9 hours if you're using cellular data. But in my experience, the iPad 10 might slightly outlast the iPad Air 5 for similar types of use, and I'm working on a more detailed battery life comparison, so I'm super excited to see the results. Well, I did notice that the iPad Air charges a little faster, and that's always nice to have. And of course, gaming is one of those things that we know just eats battery life. Now, in terms of actually being able to run games, both iPads easily chewed through Genshin, Asphalt, PUBG, and every other game that I've tried so far. I do play PUBG a lot, and I haven't really noticed a difference in terms of the gameplay itself. It's been smooth, the controls are responsive, and I don't experience any type of lag with either. Now, both iPads are able to use the same graphics settings, so smooth or balanced graphics if I want extreme frame rate, then Ultra HD graphics if I'm willing to go down to Ultra for frame rate. Now, even though every game ran well, I'm still going to give the edge to the iPad Air 5 because it has a more powerful chip and it has twice the RAM. So even though I don't really notice a difference now, game developers are always looking to push the CPU and GPU, and as the games evolve and start to demand more resources, you have additional headroom with the iPad Air 5. If you want to stream and play Xbox games with the Game Pass app, you can pair an Xbox controller with both iPads and then have an extremely smooth gameplay experience as long as you have a reliable internet connection. Now, I'm going to give the iPad Air 5 the slight edge here. It's not a big one, but the display is a bit better, it's less reflective, and the speakers sound better. And neither of these iPads have a headphone jack, so you'll need to either use wireless headphones, USB-C headphones, or you can get an adapter. Now, when we look at the configuration options, I have to say that I wish Apple did more with both of these. So the iPad 10 starts at $450 and then the iPad Air 5 at $600. And in both cases, you're only getting 64 gigabytes of internal storage, which I just don't love. I think that at this point, you should be getting 128 gigabytes on the base model and then 512 on the upgraded models. These are both incredibly powerful iPads, and for a lot of users, the only reason they would need to upgrade over the next few years would be that they run out of internal storage. Sure, you can use cloud and external storage, but iPadOS already takes more than 8 gigs of RAM, and with a couple of big games like Genshin and PUBG, you're already at almost 40 gigabytes. Both tablets can go up to 256 gigabytes of storage. They both offer Wi-Fi 6 and support for 5G, and we're getting Bluetooth 5.0 on the iPad Air 5 versus 5.2 on the newer iPad 10. So here's how I look at this decision. Like I said, if you're buying from Apple in the US, you're paying $450 for the iPad 10, $600 for the iPad Air 5. But with the links in the description, you can actually get the iPad Air 5 for $520. So now it's a $70 difference. The iPad 10 costs less, it has better battery life, I like the position of the front-facing camera, and I really love this color. A lot of times I think that the entry-level iPad is the better value, but for $70, I would rather go with the iPad Air 5 with a better and fully laminated display, better speakers, more processing power, faster file transfer speeds, and a much better user experience when it comes to using the Apple Pencil. Another option would be to get a used or refurbished iPad Air 4 for even less. Now you should see how the iPad 10 compares with the iPad 9, which you can get brand new for $300. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.